really don't have any privileges. You get them just in time, and then when you're done using that function, you no longer have that capability. If I'm a privileged user, then if my ID is compromised, then the sort of blast radius is greatly reduced when you implement a zero standing privilege capability.
Welcome to another edition of Cloud Unfiltered. I'm your host, Michael Chenetz, and today we have Gerry Gebel with us. Gerry, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, Michael, great to be with you. Yes, I'm currently VP of Product and Standards at Strata Identity, and doing all things identity orchestration. And I've got some history in authorization, which I think is our topic for today, as well as within the analyst community. And back in the day, I worked in IT at Chase Manhattan Bank. So played a number of different roles over the years.
Yeah, so today I think we'll talk a little bit about something that's really near and dear to my heart, which is that identity. And really, I think in this day and age, we have so many people accessing resources from so many different diverse areas and things like that. It's become an ever important topic that that is always on my mind. So what are some of the things that people have to consider when they're choosing some kind of solution to do this? What are some of the aspects?
Well, I think a lot of the identity and access management industry focuses on identity. Who you are, how you authenticate to a system, and so on. But to me, the access management part is really interesting because one thing to think about is that it's you're working more closely with the business applications and the business data now. It's not just how do you log into a system, but now what applications can you access, what APIs can you call, and when you're dealing with data, for example, customer data. Well, which customer records can I see? Based on some set of rules or policies. And then even within those records, there could be, say, dozens or hundreds of fields. Maybe some of that should be filtered as well based on different rules. Could be for privacy, could be for regulations, or so on. So I think one of the big things is when you dive deeply into authorization, you're really working more closely with the business side of the house and the business logic of what's going on there. So that's also usually a new territory for a lot of people. We're steeped in the technology. We like the shiny objects and how they work, but it's really marrying that to the business side of the house that I think is one of the bigger challenges.
Yeah, as a person that's recovering from shiny object syndrome, I can relate to that. But I love when we can connect the business logic and business value back to the technology, and I really think that's the right way to do it. I'm the first one that when there's a new shiny thing, I want to discover it and use it, but I'm not telling people that that's the way that we should do it. I work for emerging tech, so full disclosure, it's my job to figure out and to learn about new technologies. That doesn't mean that we should base things on technical features. I always am the one to be the biggest proponent to say, you know what is the business logic? What is the business outcome you're looking for? What is the security impact? What are the things that really matter? And then back into the technology.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, to keep that, as part of your focus, not just how does the technology work and how do I deploy it and run it, but, what is that value on the other side for the business? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's funny because I once worked for a large, when I was a consultant, I worked for this large, home improvement company. And they segregated everything. Everything was segregated, and you needed access privileges to get to any little thing. Everything was deep. And back then there weren't really great systems for doing this. So it was a lot of systems kind of trying to work together to try and figure this out. And usually you had to go to multiple places to enter the logic. And depending on which layer it was, is it the application layer? Is it the network layer? Is it, security, whatever it may be, you had to work in different systems.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a lot of almost physical barriers to those systems, right? Where today everything is software defined, right, and virtualized, and we want access to anything from anywhere, from any device, right? So that's incredibly challenging today.
Yeah. So when you're talking about, let's just break this down. So one of the things is granular access control. So obviously that's very important, but how do you even start to tackle that? Because that's something that's, it almost comes down from here's your CISO is saying, hey, we have this list of requirements. Some are from policy, some are from threats, some are, and then it's down to their teams to really implement and figure out, well, what does that mean to us?
Yeah, well, historically, all of the logic you just described, whatever those rules were or policies were essentially hard coded within an application. And a lot of that is still going on today, right? Because there isn't, or in the distant past, there wasn't a good set of tools available that I could just call that service. Like today for authentication, you wouldn't build that into your application. There's a zillion different identity providers and authentication systems out there. We just call to them and outboard or offload that functionality to those services. More recently, there's been a lot of vendors and open source projects that are building authorization systems or services. And so there's many different flavors out there for different platforms, for different use cases. And so now there's more options for developers to be able to call an API and offload that functionality. So now you get more visibility from an auditing perspective. You have more a view of these policies, right? Because they're managed outside of your app. It's not, you don't have to look through the if then else logic in your app to see what the policy is. So there's been a lot of emphasis within the identity industry over especially the last 2 to 3 years on the emergence of these authorization products and services, so that that can be a more consumable capability for application developers. I think that's one of the big steps that's happened recently.
Which is great because I remember, when I was doing software development, defining the logic for all of that stuff was a pain, and you had to figure out and think about, well, what does this really mean to a person, and how does it affect them, and what levels of granularity do you need, and how do you group those things into a policy, and all these other things that everybody can define a different way, and then if you define it a different way, then obviously observability is harder. Across apps is harder. So it's nice to hear that it's kind of the industry sounds like it's consolidating a little bit into more of a standardized approach.
Yes, and speaking of standards, that's something that's been a bit of a challenge for this part of the industry as well. We don't have SAML, the Security Assertion Markup Language, or OpenID
Sure.
Connect, or OAuth that's that widely adopted. Within the authorization space, the Extensible Access Control Markup Language, or XACML, was a standard that's been around for a while. Hasn't had that wide adoption moment. But more recently, I've been part of a new working group over at OpenID Foundation that's working to standardize some of these interactions between different components of an authorization system and the applications that they would protect. So that's, we're really excited about some of that recent development, and we can dig into that a bit more as well.
So just talking in general terms, really, it just means that if I say, if I have a word in English, it's the same word that you're mapping that to from the other side. So that way, they're kind of being the same. Everybody's using the same lexicon, if I will. Is that what you're going more towards?
Mostly, but it's also asking the same question. So put
Okay.
up, with your developer hat on, you're writing an application, and maybe the rule says, well, managers can do this function, and you would code that into your app, right? Okay, if you're a
Mhm.
manager, then you can do this. If not, fill in some failure message. Well, now
Yeah.
you have an API. Well, I can just call this service and say, okay, can Alice do this or can Bob do that? And then they can figure out, look at the rules and come back to you with a yes or a no. So the way authorization systems work, there's probably 90 to 95% overlap in what that message looks like. Can Bob do this? Can Alice do that?
Mhm.
And then the response is, again, almost identical, but it's technically not interoperable. So that's the first profile that this working group, the AuthZen working group, is working to standardize. So as a developer, you can just code to this one API, And then on the back end, the IT people can configure that to whatever product supports that API. And you don't have to be concerned about the specific semantics of product A, B, C, D, E, or F, or whatever. So it's really going to simplify the world for application developers.
So is this an open standard in terms of format, or are there actually protocols and other things that are going to be involved with it?
Yeah, so there's a draft specification for this API. So it's going to be a specific API, and we're working our way through that process for it to become formalized. Which there's a review period and then a voting period and so on. But by the end of this year, I think 1.0 of that evaluation spec, that API, will be standardized. And it has nothing to do with the policy format on the back end service. It's strictly the request and response formats.
So how do you come about these standards? I mean, obviously there's a lot of people working on this. There's a working group, but how do you agree on this stuff? This is always the interesting part to me because I know a lot of people on working groups, and I know how difficult it can be to kind of get consensus on these things.
Right,
So
right.
how do you even attempt to work through those things?
Well, I mean, first you have to get a group of people together that's motivated to get something done,
Sure.
right? And that was something that took place in the background over the last couple of years. We get a lot of this people in this community get together at the Identiverse conference. And so there were a couple of conversations, one 2 years ago, that sort of there was some motivation, but then it sort of fizzled out. But last year there was some of the same people and some others got together and said these are things we can tackle because it's better for everyone. There's the vendors are not competing on these low level technical things, right? And if we can improve the standardization, then we can improve the adoption of the whole marketplace. So there was that motivation that came together, and then subsequently put together a charter for the working group at OpenID Foundation. And what we're doing though is we're trying to tackle the simple things first. Like I said, the simple requests, can Alice do this, and what's the response look like? That's fairly simple and straightforward. And we just we work through those details, and there need to be compromises along the way, and we just try to build that consensus and move forward, and then we'll tackle the more complex things that would maybe encounter more debate going forward. So we're trying to parse out those pieces, so that we can tackle them separately.
So a lot of the stuff you're doing is on the software development layer in terms of actual creating applications. But is there a component of that that would like integrate with something like IAM or some of these other proprietary things that cloud providers are using or.
Well, we're like I said, we're tackling different pieces of the stack, if you
Yeah,
will.
yeah.
So, how does an application ask the question to a policy engine? Can this function be performed or not?
Gotcha.
Other things that we're looking at going forward are, how do we transport a policy from an administration interface to that policy engine? So that's, but all of these cases are, we're dealing with vendors with different approaches. So we're looking for common technology areas that we can standardize, but there still will be proprietary things that
Sure.
they will, say this is my business value, this is my value add over here. But there's certain parts of the stack that we're trying to standardize and make it simpler for developers, but also for the operators of these systems within enterprises.
So once this, are there people that are integrating this right now, trying this out, or is it at a level where people can, take a look at it and really work with it?
Well, we have an interoperability profile
Okay.
where we did a demonstration at the most recent Identiverse, the very end of May this year, I guess about a month and a half ago now. And like I said, the 1.0 spec of that API is now working through the process to become an implementer's draft.
Okay.
So once we are at that level, generally it's a good signal to adopters that they can use this. That's fairly stable. It's gone through intellectual property review, so they're safe from that perspective. And that's typically where people will pick it up. But for the interoperability demo, we had, I think, 12 or 13 implementations, and 10 different vendors participating in that. So that's pretty significant uptake already.
That's amazing. I mean, I know how hard it is to just to get, a couple companies working together and or organizations or whatever. And the fact that you have that many working successfully is a pretty nice accomplishment.
Yes, and we're looking to work on the next interoperability demonstration potentially in October this year. Where today we're doing a single question, can Alice do this? But then we're going to have a multi evaluation profile. So can Alice do? Can she read, write, and delete this resource, for example? So we can ask multiple questions in one message. It's a step up from the basic single message. So we hope to be doing an interoperability demo of that profile already later this year, and we're expecting to have even more vendors participating in that. So yeah, there's a lot of really good momentum happening right now.
And are there already SDKs for this API for different languages and things like that, or is that coming in the future?
Yeah, that's a bit early at
Yeah,
this
yeah.
stage, but
Okay.
that should be following on pretty soon.
Cool. So moving along with another conversation that's pretty big in this area is this idea of zero trust. Do we really ever have zero trust, and how do you get yourself into kind of a state that where you feel like you have the least amount of privileges assigned to somebody that you
Sure,
can?
sure. Yeah, I think zero trust is sort of an aspirational goal.
It
I
really
think,
is.
right? I
Yeah.
don't know if you ever get
No.
exactly to that target state.
Yes.
But I think since that terminology came out, there's been some interesting other developments that maybe support this notion. One of them is zero standing privilege, which I think is interesting. In that, so the idea there is that you really don't have any privileges.
Hmm.
You get them just in time, and then when you're done using that function, you no longer have that capability. So it's like just in time provisioning of that capability once I'm finished, and then it goes away. So that might be really useful in say I'm maintaining some system. I have to do a software patch, so I don't need to be admin for that system all the time. I just need it for the next 2 hours. So that's, I think, a really good example. And then once I complete the ticket, okay, that patch has been applied to the system. Then in the background, okay, then I no longer have system admin access to that environment. Fantastic. So then your threat service is really reduced that way, because if I'm a privileged user, then if my ID is compromised, then the sort of blast radius is greatly reduced when you implement a zero standing privilege capability. The other thing, so that's one. The other thing that's been emerging is the notion of continuous access and evaluation, or CAPE, right? So
Hmm.
this first came out of Google a couple or so years ago. It's now also a working group over at the OpenID Foundation. It's the Shared Signals Framework. So here is, and the idea of continuous comes into play here, right? So you log into a system, you have some long running session, and then, well, that's it, right? That's the extent of what an identity and access management does today, right? I have the session, great. I'm just tooling along. What if something happens? Maybe there was a password change for my account, or the access governance kicked in and my privileges were changed because I'm moving departments. Well, but I have this session, so I still have whatever access that I had when I started the session. Well, continuous access evaluation profile is a way that that signal that something changed can go to the identity system, and the identity system can do something about it. Maybe they cancel the session, make me re-log in, or whatever the action is that is appropriate. So I think those are some things that get us toward this zero trust world that people have been talking about, which I think, yeah, like I said before, it was more aspirational than actually actionable, for a long time.
Yeah, it's interesting because in every layer, we've almost made it we've really started the opposite way, because the first and foremost is that we want people to be able to do business. That's what most organizations want to do. So when you try and restrict that kind of stuff, that becomes very difficult. Even in, like, when you look at Docker images and Kubernetes and things like that, those are designed to be open first, and people
Hmm.
don't always necessarily know how to lock them down. Networks were designed to be open first, although we have newer systems that are locked down first. But you know once there's an issue that people don't like that inhibits business, then people are very quick to say, okay, well, this isn't working. We need to make it all open and we'll fix the rest later. And what never happens is they never go back and fix the rest later.
Right.
So it's interesting to see these new systems, which I think are a big, a big plus, a big step forward, because I think they have the kind of the best of both worlds, where you have these short living, type of things that you can do and then they go away. I love that. I think that to me is the future. There's no reason to keep a lot of the container connections right now. When they share certificates or they do something, they'll open a connection for when it needs it, and then they'll bring it and close it back down. You don't
Hmm.
need to keep it open. So I love that these are the things that we're thinking about. I was interested in the early days when I was in cybersecurity. They had like port knocking, where you could like knock on a port. It opens up a port for you, and then it closes it back down. So things aren't always, always there. So I
Right.
love that kind of stuff. So, but talking about, you know, how people can start to implement this kind of stuff that are maybe a little bit more hesitant. How do you start to phase into these things?
Well, you can always start small, like everything else. You don't want to tackle everything all at once because you typically end up breaking everything. So you want to, tackle a scoped environment and maybe a relatively simple one to start with before you go to more advanced scenarios. But you have to think about um, who this is going to touch or affect within your organization. Bringing in a new technology means that, okay, there's some new software, or maybe it's a SaaS service I need to run. How does it run? Who's going to operate things? In the case of authorization, who is going to write these policies for access? Where is all the data that I need for the policies? Because I need to know, okay, who's a manager, who's an engineer. I need to know information about resources. What department are they in? What product line are they associated with it? Because the rules can encompass all of this different data elements. And then how do I interact with the applications? Is there an API gateway in front of it, or do I need to change the application code to now make these standard calls out to an authorization service? So it touches a lot of different people. So you need to think about who are all the stakeholders for you, and then come up with a group of them that are in a scoped situation where you can be successful and understand how these systems work, and then you can build on that, build on those experiences.
Yeah, and it really comes back down to what we started this conversation with, which is understanding the business, and really you have to go to each group within the business, or ones that have similar application needs or access needs, and you have to go to each one and say, what are your needs? What do they use? What do these people, what do they use it at home? Do they use it locally? Do they use it, and you have to define all the different criteria to figure out, okay, what are you going to do with that? And is there some kind of mapping that maps back to?
Right, right. But it can be easier to approach this from the perspective that are there audit requirements that are unmet today? Is there some gap in capability within our infrastructure stack that we just can't get to that level of granularity to meet those audit requirements or those compliance requirements? So that's where you're addressing a real business need rather than trying to retrofit everything that was done in the past. Another approach would be for any new development, you can say, look, there's a better way to architect this system going forward so that we have better manageability, visibility, and transparency into what's going on access wise and identity wise. So you can set up a target architecture and approach for new development so that that's done in a more manageable way than maybe trying to retrofit apps that exist. Unless there's a serious problem there, then it's worth going into to do that maintenance.
And is there some kind of a, mode where you can go in and say, "Hey, I just want to turn on logging to see what would be of like what this would look like." But obviously, you probably need to set the parameters first. So I don't know. You could probably. I'm just thinking out loud here. You could probably say, "Don't enforce," but you probably have to set the parameters first to see what you see in the log in order
Yeah,
to.
yeah. There could be existing logs that you can evaluate from those applications. Depending
Yeah,
on
yeah.
what kind of level of detail. Maybe there's a debug mode that you could turn on for a period of time to see the level of detail that's happening there.
Yeah, and in terms of one of the things that you mentioned was more observability and visibility into, using this. Is there a certain format it outputs to? Is it like a JSON or is it a server like an Elk stack or what is it? How do you figure out, what does it actually output?
Well, yeah. So an authorization service would keep track of different things. So there could be from the administrative side, who is writing policies, who's changing policies, what part of the policies were changed. So there's that aspect of it, and then who is promoting a policy, say from test to QA to production. So that's another function that you would want to be aware of. And then on the application side, then you have all of the logs of who accessed different parts of the application, whether they were failures, whether they were permitted, and then so you can get all kinds of information about who is accessing the application, how often are failures happening. You can examine all of that data, for further analysis as appropriate, or even to do forensic, investigations if you need to do that sort of thing.
So
So
I guess,
so sorry. So
yeah,
the
go.
authorization system would have the logs of all of that activity for the users as well as for the administrators and what's happened on that side.
And I guess you could pull it into whatever tool of your choice is to do the analysis and,
Right.
and figure out, who's doing what and create your filters and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And correlate it to other activity and so on. Right.
Yeah, yeah. This is so, I mean, I really actually want to look into this a little bit more because I'm always looking for, when I'm just even creating little apps is how to integrate this stuff better. So I
Yeah,
find
so
it
if you
really
go,
interesting.
yeah, for folks that want to check out the standardization work, go to openid.net, look at the working groups there. It's the AuthZen working group, Authorization Exchange, so AuthZen for short. And you can see the draft interoperability spec already on that page. And probably in the next few months, we'll end up with standard implementers draft for the 1.0 of that spec, and then you can also see what our charter is all about, and join up and join the fun of building a standard.
I always find that building these standards is so interesting. I know it's really difficult. I know it's really, sometimes everybody has a lot of ideas, which could be good, but it could also be really, time consuming to kind of hash out all those things. But the passion that I find in these groups is amazing.
That's very true. It takes a certain kind of individual to do this kind of work. Everybody has a day job. There's no one in this particular working group where it's their full time job just to work on this standard. So yeah, you're talking about volunteer effort here, and people that are passionate about this area, right? About the technology that they're working on. So you're absolutely right about that.
So I do this kind of piece in between each one of my episodes, which I call buzzworthy or buzzworthless. The idea is that I give you a term and you can tell me whether it's still buzzworthy or buzzworthless, and your answer and why. And sometimes they're in between. So you might they may have been buzzworthy at one point, but maybe they're buzzworthless now. So I'm going to give you a couple terms that are just related to this. Zero trust, is that a buzzworthy term or is it buzzworthless at this point? Buzzworthless.
I give you the double thumbs down on that one. It's sort of an annoying term to me.
Yeah.
I think we talked about it earlier and why. I think there's some more actionable things we can do. But zero trust, yeah, thrown around too much, I think it's lost its value.
How about observability? Because that could mean so many different things, and it also kind of goes with single pane of glass, which I don't think anyone has ever done effectively. So observability, is that buzzworthy or buzzworthless?
I don't know if it's buzzworthy, but I like that term more than zero trust. I think it's not a term that I use very often, but I think it does apply to the work we're doing here within authorization. Because I usually use the term transparency or visibility, but I think
Mhm.
observability is sort of in that same neighborhood, where we want to be able to see what's going on. And observability maybe comes from more of a performance or metrics or that sort of angle. Maybe, I don't know, but I yeah, I would be approving of that term versus zero trust for sure.
The one that I'm not going to ask you anymore, but the one that always gets me is full stack observability, because I've never seen anyone implement a full stack that I could look at from like network all the way to code to say I can observe everything in between. It's just never happened.
Yeah, I wouldn't believe that either.
So we only have a few minutes left. Anything you want to leave people with that we didn't cover, or that you just want to kind of let people know?
Yeah, maybe just to reinforce, for folks to look up what we're up to here in the standardization process, go to the openid.net page and look for the AuthZen working group. You can follow along what we're doing there, and I definitely invite people to come in and join. Even if they just want to observe, to use a term, observe what's going on, and because we do have some folks doing that because they're just interested in how the sausage is made behind the scenes. We certainly welcome participants. We meet every week, but we alternate time zones. So we have folks join from North America, from Europe, and from the Australia region. So we're alternating times every other week. So we're trying to accommodate folks to come in and be with us as we continue to work on standardizing the authorization space.
That's amazing. I might have to come listen in at some point just to see what you guys are up to.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been an amazing conversation, and I really think that this is some of the work that we really, really need and desperately need in this realm.
Well, it's been great to talk to you, Michael. Appreciate it very much.